In our work at API Equality LA, we begin with the knowledge that there are similarities in the historic experiences of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals today. Only 100 years ago, APIs were subject to hostile government policies that strictly limited their ability to enter the U.S. These laws also regulated who APIs could marry and whether or not they could establish families and communities in the U.S. This shared history of discrimination between API and LGBT communities underscores the importance of coming together as a broader community to fight social injustices. In the beginning of the 19th century, thousands of Chinese immigrants came to the U.S. to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. But fears over this new cheap labor resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. This law suspended immigration from China and prevented the Chinese men already in the U.S. from being reunited with their families. Immigrants from Japan began entering the U.S. to replace the Chinese immigrants. But in 1907, the government of Japan made an informal agreement with the U.S. government called the Gentleman's Agreement. Japan agreed to stop issuing passports allowing Japanese citizens to come to the U.S. to work, and the U.S. agreed to allow the wives and children of Japanese Americans to immigrate and go to school. However, in the eyes of the U.S. government, these measures were not sufficiently slowing the tide of Asian immigration. The U.S. Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924, which included the Asian Exclusion Act. This legislation severely restricted immigration based on race and national origin and was specifically designed to limit immigration from Asia. There were also a number of policies that restricted the ability of API immigrants to grow and sustain their families. The Page Act of 1875 prohibited Chinese women from entering the U.S. because it was assumed that they were prostitutes. The law created an overwhelmingly male population in the Chinese American community and effectively barred Chinese American men from marrying Chinese women and starting families in the U.S. Although many Japanese Americans were able to start families through the practice of picture brides, the 1921 Ladies' Agreement put an end to this loophole for Japanese women to join their husbands in the U.S. Beyond laws barring the immigration of Asians to the U.S., there were also a number of laws that limited who APIs could marry. Anti-miscegenation laws prohibited interracial marriages between whites and people of color. Although the laws mainly prohibited marriage between whites and blacks, they also applied to Asians and Pacific Islanders. In 1901, California specifically banned marriage between whites and Mongolians. In 1933, after a California court ruled that a Filipino was a Malay and not a Mongolian and could thus marry a white woman, they remedied that oversight so that Malays were also prohibited from marrying whites. The U.S. government also decided to punish white women who dared to violate anti-miscegenation laws. Any white woman who married an Asian man was stripped of her U.S. citizenship. It was not until the mid-1900s that anti-miscegenation laws were finally struck down, first in the California Supreme Court in 1948, and then 20 years later in the U.S. Supreme Court. Rationales offered against interracial marriage mirror today's arguments against marriage between same-sex partners. Opponents of interracial marriage argued that the races were biologically separate and should be kept that way. They also claimed that God in the Bible said not to mix races, and that it would be culturally harmful to have mixed-race families. Although the API community in California had grown to 10% of the state's population in 1860, these laws caused the population to shrink to less than 2% by 1950. We can see from this history that the U.S. government treated APIs as second-class citizens, or not as citizens at all, severely limited their ability to marry who they wanted, and to create their own families and communities. These clearly discriminatory laws mirror homophobic laws that oppress the LGBT community today. It is important that APIs make sure no community suffers from such discrimination again. API Equality LA now works to make sure that APIs are at the forefront of movement for LGBT equality. Join us today in making a difference.